Sterling Ravencrest's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips the moment he heard the magic words. 12 million in historic properties, the elderly woman beside Serafina was saying, her voice carrying across the marble foyer of the Moonrise Bay Country Club. Her grandfather left her 5 of the most beautiful Victorian estates along the coast. Can you imagine inheriting something like that at 28? Sterling set his glass down on the nearest table, his practiced smile never wavering as he watched the young woman in the navy dress laugh at something her companion said. Serafina Ashworth. He'd seen her name on the guest list, but hadn't bothered to research her background. Now he was kicking himself for the oversight. $12 million. Historic properties. And she looked naive enough to trust a charming stranger. Excuse me, he murmured to his conversation partner, already moving toward his target. Serafina was studying the auction items displayed along the wall when he approached, her green eyes focused intently on a vintage compass. Something about her concentration struck him as genuine, unlike the affected interest most women showed at these charity galas. Beautiful piece, he said, positioning himself beside her. 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. She turned, and he got his first good look at her face. Pretty in an understated way, with the kind of natural elegance that couldn't be bought. More importantly, she had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who didn't quite belong in this world of old money and older secrets. Perfect. You know antiques? She asked, her voice carrying a slight Maine accent that suggested she hadn't grown up in the rarefied air of Moonrise Bay society. I dabble in collecting, Sterling replied smoothly. Sterling Ravencrest. And you must be Serafina Ashworth. I heard someone mention you're an architect. The way her eyebrows rose slightly told him she was surprised he knew her name. Good. He liked having the upper hand from the start. Word travels fast around here, she said with a laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. Yes, I specialize in historic preservation. I've been working on restoring some of the older buildings in town. How fascinating. Historic preservation is a passion of mine as well. It wasn't, but Sterling had learned long ago that shared interests were the fastest way to build trust. I imagine you must have quite a collection of historic properties yourself. There it was. The slight hesitation before she answered, the way she glanced around as if checking who might be listening. She wasn't comfortable discussing her inheritance with strangers, which meant she was smart enough to be cautious. He'd have to work harder than usual. I'm fortunate to have inherited a few family properties, she said carefully. They keep me busy. I'd love to hear about your restoration projects sometime, perhaps over dinner this week. The question hung between them for a moment too long. Sterling watched her internal debate play out across her face, the way she was clearly trying to decide if he was genuinely interested in historic preservation or just using it as a line. He kept his expression earnest and slightly vulnerable, the look that had worked on countless women before her. I don't really know you, she said finally. Fair enough. What would you like to know? Before she could answer, a redhead appeared at Serafina's elbow, her sharp blue eyes immediately sizing up Sterling with the practiced assessment of someone who dealt with liars for a living. Sarah, there you are. The silent auction is closing in 10 minutes if you wanted to bid on that maritime collection. Oh, right. Serafina looked relieved at the interruption. Sterling, this is my friend Cordelia Whitmore. Cordelia, Sterling Ravencrest. Cordelia's handshake was firm enough to be challenging. Ravencrest, as in Ravencrest Development. Guilty as charged, Sterling replied with his most disarming smile. The family business had a reputation for aggressive expansion, but most people were too polite to mention it directly. Interesting timing, running into Sarah here tonight, Cordelia said, her tone conversational but her eyes watchful. Considering your company just submitted a bid for the waterfront development project she's consulting on. Sterling felt his jaw tighten slightly before he caught himself. He hadn't known Serafina was involved in that project, but he should have. The family made it their business to know every detail about potential acquisitions, and that included the people who might stand in their way. Small world, he said easily. Though I have to confess, I'm much more interested in preservation than development tonight. How convenient, Cordelia murmured. Serafina was looking between them with growing confusion. Wait, you two know each other? Not exactly, Sterling said before Cordelia could respond. But your friend is clearly very protective of you. I respect that. He pulled out his business card, a heavy cream stock with his personal number embossed in gold. When you're ready to discuss historic preservation or anything else, please call me. No pressure. Serafina took the card, her fingers brushing his briefly. Sterling felt a flicker of something unexpected, an actual attraction that had nothing to do with her inheritance. She really was lovely, in a way that made him almost regret what he was planning to do to her. Almost. "Thank you," she said, slipping the card into her purse. "It was nice meeting you." "The pleasure was entirely mine." Sterling walked away knowing Cordelia's eyes were burning holes in his back, but he didn't care. The seed was planted. Within a week, he'd have Serafina Ashworth convinced he was the most charming man in Maine. Within 6 months, he'd have a ring on her finger. And within a year, he'd have control of $12 million in historic properties. The Ravencrest family had been playing this game for 3 generations. They never lost. Behind him, he heard Cordelia's voice, low and urgent. "Sarah, be careful with that one. I have a bad feeling about him." Sterling smiled to himself as he rejoined his father near the bar. Let the friend have her suspicions. It would make his eventual victory all the sweeter. 18 months later, Serafina stood in the kitchen of her grandfather's Victorian estate in Willowbrook, watching Sterling examine the original crown molding with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the gold flecks in her engagement ring, a family heirloom from the Ravencrest collection that Sterling had presented with a perfectly rehearsed speech about tradition and legacy. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," Sterling said, running his fingers along the intricate woodwork. "Your grandfather had impeccable taste." Serafina smiled, still feeling that warm flutter she got whenever Sterling showed interest in her family's history. "He spent 40 years collecting these properties. Each one has its own story. Tell me again about the others." She led him through the house as she had dozens of times before, pointing out the restored stained glass windows, the original hardwood floors, the carefully preserved architectural details. Sterling listened with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most interesting person in the world. "So this is one of 5, he said as they reached the master bedroom. "The others are spread along the coast? 2 in Bar Harbor, 1 in Camden, and the crown jewel in Kennebunkport. That one's been in the family since 1847. She perched on the window seat, looking out at the gardens her grandfather had designed. "The total appraised value is just over $12 million, but honestly, I can't imagine ever selling them. They're not just properties, they're living history." Sterling sat beside her, taking her hand in both of his. "That's what I love about you, Sarah. You understand that some things are more valuable than money." The sincerity in his voice made her heart skip, just as it had during their first dinner date, when he'd spent 2 hours asking about her restoration projects. Sterling had pursued her with the kind of old-fashioned courtship she'd thought existed only in movies, sending flowers with handwritten notes, planning elaborate dates that somehow always involved her interests rather than his. "I've been thinking," he continued, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "about our future together, about how to protect everything we're building." "Protect it from what?" "Taxes, primarily. Estate planning. When 2 families with significant assets unite, there are legal considerations." Sterling's expression grew serious. "My father's been advising me about the best way to structure our finances after the wedding. Apparently, there are substantial tax advantages to consolidating historic properties under a family trust." Serafina felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Money talks always made her uncomfortable, partly because she'd never had to think about it growing up, and partly because the numbers involved with her inheritance still felt surreal. What kind of consolidation? Nothing dramatic. Just moving the properties into a joint trust that would protect them from estate taxes and potential legal challenges. "My family's attorneys have handled similar arrangements for other historic property owners in Maine." The way Sterling explained it made sense, even if the legal terminology went over her head. She'd inherited the properties free and clear, but she'd also inherited the responsibility of maintaining them, along with the constant worry about property taxes and insurance costs. "Would I still have control over restoration decisions?" "Of course. You'd be the primary trustee. I'd just be there to help with the financial management side of things." Sterling squeezed her hand. "I want to protect what's yours, Sarah. These properties are part of your family's legacy." Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Cordelia asking about their dinner plans. Sterling glanced at the screen, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your friend still doesn't trust me. Cordelia's protective. She's been my best friend since law school. I respect that, but sometimes I wonder if she's looking for problems that don't exist. Serafina had noticed the tension between Sterling and Cordelia over the past year and a half. Her friend had never warmed up to her fiancé, always finding subtle ways to question his motives or change the subject when Serafina gushed about their relationship. It was the one shadow over an otherwise perfect romance. She'll come around, Serafina said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. They were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the circular drive. Serafina looked out to see a black sedan with tinted windows, not a vehicle she recognized. Are you expecting someone? Sterling asked, moving to the window. No, but people get lost looking for the lighthouse sometimes. I'll go check. The man who emerged from the sedan didn't look lost. He was tall and lean with tousled dark hair and the kind of easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable anywhere. He carried a professional camera bag and wore a casual button-down that had seen better days, but somehow looked expensive anyway. Serafina opened the front door before he could knock. Can I help you? Sorry to bother you. I'm Caspian Silverstone. His smile was warm and slightly apologetic. I'm a photographer, and I was wondering if I could take some shots of your property for a coffee table book I'm working on. Historic Estates of Coastal Maine. Oh, Serafina glanced back at Sterling, who had appeared behind her. This is actually private property. Of course, I should have called first. Caspian pulled out a business card. I've been documenting some of the more significant historic properties in the area. Your place came highly recommended by the Historical Society. Sterling stepped forward, extending his hand. Sterling Ravencrest. And you are? Caspian Silverstone. Pleasure to meet you. There was something in the way the two men shook hands, a subtle tension that Serafina couldn't quite identify. Sterling's smile had shifted into what she privately called his business mode, polite but calculating. Silverstone, Sterling repeated. That name sounds familiar. It's not uncommon around here, Caspian said easily. My family's been in Maine for generations. What kind of photography do you specialize in? Serafina asked, intrigued despite herself. Architectural photography, primarily. I've done some work for preservation societies, real estate firms, that sort of thing. Caspian's golden eyes met hers briefly. I'm particularly interested in properties that have been lovingly restored rather than commercially developed. Well, Sarah's certainly done beautiful work here, Sterling said, his arm sliding possessively around her waist. But we're actually in the middle of some family business today. Of course, I don't want to intrude. Caspian handed his card to Serafina. If you change your mind, I'd be honored to include your property in the book. No charge, naturally. Serafina took the card, noticing that his fingers were stained with what looked like photo developer chemicals. Thank you. I'll think about it. I hope you will. There's something special about places that have been preserved with love rather than just money. After Caspian left, Sterling was quiet for longer than usual. Everything okay? Serafina asked. Fine. Just thinking about the trust arrangements we discussed. Maybe we should move faster on that than I originally planned. Faster how? Sterling turned to face her, his blue eyes intense. Marry me next month, Sarah. I don't want to wait anymore. The proposal caught her off guard, even though they'd been engaged for 6 months. Next month? But we haven't even finished planning. We'll figure it out. I just have this feeling that the sooner we're officially family, the better. Sterling cupped her face in his hands. I love you. I want to protect you and everything you've inherited. Let me do that. Looking into his eyes, Serafina felt that familiar flutter of certainty that she'd found her person. Sterling might move fast sometimes, but it was only because he was as eager as she was to start their life together. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. Sterling's kiss tasted like victory, though Serafina didn't recognize the flavor at the time. Serafina stared at the stack of legal documents spread across Sterling's mahogany desk, her coffee growing cold as she tried to make sense of the dense legal language. 3 weeks before their wedding, and Sterling had presented her with what he called routine paperwork that looked anything but routine. This section here, she said, pointing to a paragraph thick with terms like irrevocable transfer and sole discretionary authority. It sounds like I'm signing over management of all my properties to the Ravencrest Family Trust. Sterling didn't look up from his laptop, where he was supposedly reviewing catering menus. It's just a formality, darling. The trust provides better tax protection than individual ownership. My attorney explained it all last week. But I wasn't there for that explanation. Because you were handling the florist crisis, remember? The peonies versus roses debate? Sterling's smile was indulgent, the kind reserved for someone who couldn't be expected to understand complicated financial matters. Don't worry about the legal specifics. That's what we pay attorneys for. The condescension in his tone made Serafina's jaw tighten. She'd restored 5 historic properties from near ruin, managed million-dollar renovation budgets, and navigated complex preservation regulations. She wasn't some helpless debutante who needed financial decisions made for her. I'd like to have my own attorney review these before I sign anything. Sterling's fingers paused over his keyboard for just a moment. Of course, though it might delay our honeymoon plans if we have to wait for another legal review. The yacht charter in the Mediterranean doesn't offer refunds after this Friday. Since when are we chartering a yacht? It was supposed to be a surprise. Sterling closed his laptop and moved to the window, his shoulders tense beneath his tailored shirt. I wanted our honeymoon to be perfect, unforgettable. Serafina studied his profile, noting the tight line of his mouth. In 18 months of dating, she'd learned to recognize when Sterling was frustrated, and this felt different somehow. More urgent. The papers can wait until after the honeymoon, she said finally. What's a few more weeks? Actually, there are some time-sensitive tax implications tied to the end of the fiscal year. If we don't file before December 31st, we lose some significant advantages. The wedding was scheduled for December 15th. 2 weeks to get married, sign papers, and restructure her entire financial life. When had everything become so rushed? Before she could voice her concerns, Sterling's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. I need to take this. Wedding vendor emergency. He stepped into the hallway, leaving Serafina alone with the documents. She flipped through the pages again, looking for anything that resembled plain English. Most of it was incomprehensible legal jargon, but one phrase kept appearing. In the event of incapacitation or death of the primary beneficiary. A chill ran down her spine. Why would a simple tax arrangement need so many clauses about her death? Miss Ashworth. Serafina looked up to find Sterling's housekeeper, Mrs. Chun, standing in the doorway with a business card in her hand. A photographer is here about the wedding. He says he has an appointment? I didn't schedule any photographers today. Serafina glanced toward the hallway where she could hear Sterling's muffled voice, his tone sharp with irritation. He says he was recommended by the country club. Something about replacing the photographer who had a family emergency? Serafina's stomach dropped. Their original photographer had called that morning to cancel due to a death in the family, leaving them scrambling 3 weeks before the wedding. She'd mentioned it to Sterling, but he'd been distracted by a business call. Send him in. Caspian Silverstone appeared in the doorway carrying the same camera bag she remembered from his visit to Willowbrook. Today he wore dark jeans and a gray Henley that made his golden eyes look almost amber. Ms. Ashworth, thank you for seeing me on short notice. His smile was apologetic but confident. I heard through the country club that you might need a wedding photographer. How did you hear about that? We only found out this morning. The photography community in Maine is pretty tight-knit. Word travels fast when someone needs help. Caspian set his camera bag on the floor. I know we met under different circumstances, but I'd be honored to photograph your wedding if you're interested. Serafina found herself studying his face, trying to figure out what felt different about him compared to the other vendors they'd dealt with. Most wedding professionals had a slightly desperate edge, eager to please and quick to agree to any request. Caspian seemed genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as a paycheck. Do you have a portfolio I could look at? Of course. He pulled out an iPad and handed it to her. I specialize in candid moments rather than formal poses. I think weddings should feel natural, not staged. The photos on his tablet were stunning. Real couples laughing, crying, dancing, completely unaware of the camera. He'd captured something honest in each image, moments that felt stolen rather than orchestrated. These are beautiful, Serafina said, scrolling through the gallery. You have a gift for capturing people when they think no one's watching. Sometimes the most important moments happen in between the official ones. There was something in his tone that made her look up, and for a moment their eyes met with an intensity that caught her off guard. She felt her cheeks warm, and quickly returned her attention to the tablet. What's your rate? For you? Just my expenses. Consider it a wedding gift. That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't ask you to work for free. You're not asking. I'm offering. Caspian leaned forward slightly. I have a feeling your wedding is going to tell an important story. I'd like to be the one to document it. Something about the way he said important story made her pulse quicken, though she couldn't say why. Sterling will want to meet you first, she said, glancing toward the door. Of course, though I should mention that I prefer to work independently. I find that couples get more natural photos when they're not worrying about managing their photographer. Sterling's voice grew louder in the hallway, his tone increasingly agitated. Serafina caught fragments of his conversation, timeline, complications, and handled it immediately. Business troubles? Caspian asked casually. Wedding stress, probably. Everything feels urgent when you're planning a wedding in 3 weeks. 3 weeks is quite a rush. Sterling's eager to start our married life. Serafina realized how defensive she sounded and forced a smile. Some people plan for years. We prefer to be spontaneous. Caspian nodded, but something in his expression suggested he didn't buy the spontaneous explanation any more than she did. Sterling returned, his face flushed with irritation that he quickly masked when he saw Caspian. Mr. Silverstone, I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Small world, especially in the wedding industry. Caspian stood and extended his hand. I understand you need a photographer. Sterling's handshake lasted a beat too long, and Serafina noticed the way both men seemed to be sizing each other up. Your references check out? Sterling asked. I'm sure they do. Caspian's smile didn't waver. I've never had an unsatisfied client. Good, because this wedding needs to be perfect. No mistakes, no surprises. I understand completely, Caspian said. Some events are too important to leave to chance. The test photos arrived in Serafina's email at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before the wedding. She'd been lying in bed reviewing the final guest list when her phone chimed with Caspian's message. Thought you might want to see these before our final planning session. Serafina opened the attachment, expecting the usual collection of venue shots and lighting tests. Instead, she found herself staring at a series of photographs that made her breath catch. The first image showed the country club's main staircase from an unusual low angle, the ornate railing creating geometric patterns against the wall. The second captured the library's reading alcove, but the camera had focused on the way shadows fell across the leather-bound books rather than the furniture itself. The third showed the ballroom from above, emphasizing the intricate parquet floor pattern. Individually, they were striking architectural photographs. Together, they felt like something else entirely. Serafina found herself tracing the lines with her finger, following the visual paths Caspian had created. The angles weren't random. They formed a sequence, each image leading the eye toward a specific focal point. When she lined up the photos side by side on her laptop screen, the pattern became unmistakable. The geometric lines and shadow patterns, when viewed together, spelled out a single word: careful. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the message hidden in plain sight. Was she imagining it? Reading meaning into coincidental composition choices? She closed the laptop and tried to dismiss the feeling, but sleep eluded her. At 2 a.m., she gave up and padded down to Sterling's study, hoping to find something boring enough to make her drowsy. The legal documents were still spread across his desk, where she'd left them that afternoon. Serafina turned on the desk lamp and picked up the stack, telling herself she was just being thorough. These papers would govern her financial future. She had every right to understand them completely. This time, she read more carefully, looking up unfamiliar terms on her phone. What she discovered made her stomach clench with something approaching nausea. The trust agreement wasn't just about tax advantages. It was a complete transfer of ownership, with Sterling and his father listed as co-trustees with full authority to buy, sell, or mortgage any properties in the trust. Her signature would give them the legal right to liquidate her entire inheritance without her consent. Serafina set the papers down with shaking hands. There had to be an explanation. Sterling wouldn't deceive her about something this significant. Maybe she was misunderstanding the legal language. She was reaching for her phone to text Cordelia when she noticed Sterling's laptop was still open on the desk, the screen dark but not fully shut. Without thinking, she touched the trackpad. The screen illuminated, showing Sterling's email inbox. She knew she shouldn't look, knew it was a violation of privacy, but something compelled her to scan the message previews visible on the screen. Most were routine business correspondence, but one sender's name made her blood freeze. Harrison Blackwood, private investigator. The subject line read, Updated background report. S. Ashworth property valuations. Serafina's hands trembled as she clicked on the message, her conscience screaming even as her finger moved. The email was dated 6 months before they'd met at the country club gala. Sterling, attached is the comprehensive background check you requested on Serafina Ashworth. Property assessments confirm total value at $12.3 million as suspected. She appears to have no close family other than elderly aunt in California. No serious romantic relationships in past 3 years. Recommend the historical preservation angle as initial approach. Her social media shows extensive interest in architectural restoration projects. She volunteers at the Maritime Museum Tuesday evenings. Best access point appears to be the Oceanic Foundation Gala on October 15th, where she's listed as attending solo. Serafina stopped reading, her vision blurring as the implications crashed over her. Sterling had researched her before they met. He'd known about her inheritance, her interests, her schedule. Their chance encounter at the gala had been orchestrated from the beginning. She scrolled down to see more emails between Sterling and the investigator, spanning the entire length of their relationship. Updates on her daily routines, her friendships, her financial habits. Even notes about her conversations with Cordelia, somehow obtained through means she didn't want to contemplate. The most recent email was from last week. Recommend accelerating timeline. Subject is beginning to ask questions about legal documents. Suggest completing property transfers before New Year to avoid potential complications. Serafina closed the laptop and sat in the dark study, her whole world crashing down around her. 18 months of what she'd thought was the greatest love story of her life had been an elaborate con game. Every shared laugh, every intimate moment, every profession of love had been calculated to separate her from her inheritance. She thought of all the times Sterling had encouraged her to trust him with financial decisions, how he'd isolated her from friends who might ask inconvenient questions, how he'd rushed their engagement and wedding timeline. The signs had been there, but she'd been too blinded by what she'd thought was love to see them. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, she thought it might be Sterling, somehow sensing that she'd discovered his deception. Instead, it was from an unknown number. This is Caspian. I know it's late, but I need to speak with Cordelia urgently. Can you give me her number? It's about your wedding. Serafina stared at the message, remembering the hidden word in his photographs. Somehow, Caspian knew something was wrong. But how much did he know, and why was he trying to help her? She forwarded Cordelia's contact information and added a message. Tell her I found something. We need to talk. Within minutes, her phone rang. Cordelia's voice was sharp with concern and something that sounded like relief. Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to find a way to tell you. That photographer contacted me tonight. He has information about Sterling that you need to hear. What kind of information? The kind that explains why I never trusted him from the beginning. Cordelia's tone was grim. Meet us at my office tomorrow morning. Early, before Sterling expects you anywhere. And Sarah, don't sign anything else. Don't give him access to any more of your accounts. Promise me. I promise. After hanging up, Serafina sat alone in Sterling's study, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. She thought about the woman she'd been 24 hours ago, blissfully planning her dream wedding to a man she'd thought loved her. That woman seemed like a stranger now, naive and trusting in ways that felt almost pathetic. But as the initial shock began to fade, something else took its place. Not just hurt or humiliation, but a cold, steady anger that settled into her bones like winter frost. Sterling Ravencrest had built his deception on the assumption that she was weak, gullible, easily manipulated. He'd been wrong about that, and tomorrow she was going to start showing him exactly how wrong he'd been. The wedding was still 2 weeks away. Plenty of time to turn the tables on a man who thought he'd already won. Cordelia's law office felt like a sanctuary at 7 a.m., with its floor-to-ceiling law books and the familiar smell of leather and coffee. Serafina sat in the conference room, clutching a mug that had grown cold in her hands, while Caspian spread documents across the polished table with the methodical precision of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. The Ravencrest family has been running this con for 3 generations, Caspian said, his voice steady, but his golden eyes burning with an intensity she'd never seen before. They target wealthy women, particularly those who've inherited historic properties along the Maine coast. The pattern is always the same: romantic courtship, rushed engagement, legal documents that transfer ownership, then either divorce or something more permanent. Serafina stared at the photographs he'd laid out. Pictures of women she didn't recognize, all beautiful, all radiating the same trusting happiness she'd felt just days ago. Red X marks had been drawn across half the faces. What happened to them? The lucky ones lost their fortunes and got discarded. The unlucky ones. Caspian's jaw tightened. Let's just say the Ravencrest family has an unusual number of widowed sons. Cordelia leaned forward, her legal training taking over. We need specifics, Caspian. Allegations this serious require evidence. I have evidence. Caspian pulled out a thick manila folder. More than you'll want to see, probably. But before I show you everything, Serafina needs to understand who I really am. He turned to face her directly, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten with anticipation. My name is Caspian Silverstone, but 15 years ago my family owned half the historic properties in coastal Maine. Properties that are now in the Ravencrest portfolio. The words hit her like a physical blow. Your family lost their properties to Sterling's family? Lost isn't the right word. Stolen is more accurate. Caspian's voice carried 15 years of suppressed rage. My parents owned 7 Victorian estates, including 3 that bordered your grandfather's land. When I was 15, my father started receiving threats about unpaid debts he'd never incurred. Forged documents appeared claiming he'd defaulted on loans that didn't exist. When he tried to fight it legally, his attorney was suddenly killed in a car accident. Serafina felt the room spinning around her. Killed. Made to look like an accident, just like your grandfather's death 3 years later. The coffee mug slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the conference room floor. My grandfather died of a heart attack. According to the medical examiner, yes. But I've spent 15 years investigating the Ravencrest family's methods. Caspian opened the folder and pulled out a medical report. Your grandfather had no history of heart problems. He was in perfect health according to his physician just weeks before he died. But toxicology showed traces of a compound that mimics natural heart failure. Cordelia was already reaching for the document, her legal instincts kicking in even as her face went pale. This is a copy. Where's the original? Destroyed in a convenient fire at the medical examiner's office 6 months after your grandfather's death, along with 12 other suspicious case files. Caspian pulled out more photographs. But I managed to get copies before the fire. I've been building this case for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to bring down the entire family. Serafina stared at the medical report, seeing her grandfather's name at the top, but unable to process the implications. You think they murdered him? I know they did. Just like they murdered my parents, my attorney, and at least 6 other people who stood in their way. Caspian's voice was gentle despite the horrific words he was speaking. Your grandfather's properties were worth too much to leave to chance. They needed him gone so you'd inherit young and vulnerable. But I was 25 when he died. Hardly a child. Old enough to inherit. Young enough to be manipulated by the right man. They'd been watching you for years, Serafina. Sterling didn't meet you by accident 3 years later. He met you when they decided you were ready to be harvested. The clinical brutality of that last word made bile rise in her throat. She'd been a mark, a target, prey being stalked by predators who'd planned her destruction before she'd even known they existed. Show me everything, she whispered. For the next 2 hours, Caspian laid out a case that spanned decades. Bank records showing mysterious payments to hired killers. Insurance claims filed suspiciously soon after convenient accidents. Property transfers that happened within weeks of target deaths. A network of corrupt officials, complicit attorneys, and hired muscle that stretched across 3 states. The most damning evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Sterling and his father from just last week. The Ashworth girl is getting suspicious about the trust documents, Sterling's voice said through Cordelia's laptop speakers. We might need to accelerate the timeline. How suspicious? The older man's voice was cold, calculating. She wants her own attorney to review everything. And that photographer showing up has me concerned. Too many coincidences. Handle the photographer first. Then move to the backup plan for the honeymoon. The sedatives? Enough to keep her compliant for the document signing, but not enough to raise questions if anyone finds out later. Once the properties are transferred, we can decide whether she's more useful alive or dead. Serafina's hands were shaking so violently she had to clasp them together to stop the trembling. They were planning to drug her on their honeymoon, force her to sign away everything she owned, then potentially kill her to keep her quiet. "This recording won't be admissible in court," Cordelia said, though her voice was thick with disgust. "It was obtained illegally." "I'm not interested in court proceedings," Caspian replied. "I'm interested in justice." "What does that mean?" Caspian looked directly at Serafina, and she saw something fierce and protective in his golden eyes that made her pulse quicken despite everything she'd just learned. "It means we're going to destroy them the same way they destroyed my family and plan to destroy yours. Publicly, completely, and permanently." He leaned forward. "Your wedding is in 3 days. 300 guests from Maine's most influential families. What if we gave them a show they'd never forget? You want to expose them at the wedding? I want to expose them everywhere it will hurt most. In front of their peers, their business partners, their co-conspirators. I want to make sure the Ravencrest name becomes synonymous with murder and theft." Caspian's smile was sharp as a blade. "And I want Sterling to understand exactly what it feels like to have everything stolen from him." Serafina looked between her best friend and the man who'd spent 15 years planning this moment. 3 days ago, she'd been planning the happiest day of her life. Now she was planning her revenge. "What do you need me to do?" The basement of Cordelia's brownstone had been transformed into a war room. Maps of Moonrise Bay covered one wall, photographs of the Ravencrest family's victims covered another, and a complex timeline stretched across a third, connecting decades of suspicious deaths and property transfers with red string like something from a crime thriller. Serafina stood in the center of it all, feeling like she'd stepped into a parallel universe where her quiet life as an architect had become a calculated battle against murderers. 2 days until her wedding, and instead of final dress fittings, she was learning how to wire herself for sound. "The transmitter goes here," Caspian said, his fingers gently adjusting the small device against her collarbone. "It's virtually invisible under fabric, and the range is good for about 200 yards. His touch was clinical, professional, but Serafina felt her skin warm where his fingers brushed against her neck. She'd been trying to ignore the growing attraction she felt toward him, telling herself it was just gratitude mixed with adrenaline. But working closely with him for the past 3 days had revealed layers of intelligence, compassion, and quiet strength that made her chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to longing. "Will it pick up everything?" she asked, focusing on the technical details rather than the way his golden eyes seemed to see straight through her. "Everything within 15 feet. Sterling won't be able to whisper a confession without us hearing it." Caspian stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Once we start, there's no going back." "I'm sure." The certainty in her own voice surprised her. 3 days ago, she would have said revenge wasn't in her nature. Now she understood that some betrayals changed you at a cellular level, rewriting your fundamental understanding of who you were and what you were capable of. Cordelia looked up from her laptop, where she'd been coordinating with contacts at the FBI and State Attorney General's office. Agent Morrison confirmed they'll have undercover officers posing as catering staff. The moment Sterling confesses to anything criminal, they can move in. "What about the guests?" Serafina asked. "Some of these people have been family friends for years. Some of these people have been complicit in the Ravencrest crimes for years," Caspian said grimly. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the rest. "We found Sterling's father's insurance files. Detailed records of every family they've destroyed, every official they've bought, every witness they've silenced. He kept everything as leverage against potential betrayal." Serafina flipped through the documents, recognizing names from Maine's social register. Judges, prosecutors, police commissioners, all receiving regular payments from Ravencrest accounts. The corruption went deeper than she'd imagined. "Judge Harrison signed the order that seized my family's properties," Caspian said quietly. "He's been on their payroll for 20 years. Senator McKenzie's wife lost her first husband in a convenient hunting accident after he refused to sell his waterfront property. The accident was arranged by the same man who killed your grandfather." "How do you know all this?" Because I've spent 15 years becoming very good at things I never wanted to learn. Breaking into secure buildings, copying files, tracking financial records through shell companies. Caspian's smile was bitter. I was supposed to be a wildlife photographer. Instead, I became something between a private investigator and a vigilante. Serafina studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched when he talked about his family's destruction. You could have gone to the authorities years ago with this evidence. Half the authorities are on their payroll. The other half wouldn't believe me without corroborating witnesses, and most of the witnesses are dead. Caspian turned to meet her gaze. I needed someone on the inside, someone they trusted enough to confess to. I never expected. What? I never expected to care what happened to you beyond using you as bait. The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that made Serafina's heart race. She'd been trying not to think about what would happen after the wedding, after Sterling was exposed and arrested. Would Caspian disappear back into whatever shadows he'd emerged from? Would this intensity between them survive without the shared mission binding them together? Sarah, Cordelia called from across the room, breaking the spell. You need to see this. They gathered around her laptop, where she'd pulled up Sterling's email account. Caspian had hacked into it the previous night, and new messages were still coming in. Look at this one from his father, Cordelia said, highlighting a message timestamped just 20 minutes ago. Sterling, media situation developing. Channel 8 investigative team asking questions about Silverstone family properties. Recommend implementing immediate containment protocols. Wedding may need to be postponed. Serafina felt ice form in her stomach. They know Caspian's investigating them. Not necessarily, Caspian said, though his expression was tense. They might just be paranoid. The Silverstone name would raise flags for them under any circumstances. Sterling's reply appeared in real time as they watched. Too late to postpone without raising suspicions. Proceed with ceremony as planned. We'll handle photographer situation during reception. Handle photographer situation? Serafina's voice rose with alarm. What does that mean? Caspian was already moving toward a duffel bag in the corner, pulling out what looked like tactical gear. It means they're planning to kill me tomorrow. Then we call it off. It's not worth your life. It's worth a lot more than my life. Caspian's voice was steady, but his eyes were blazing. This is our only chance to get them all in one place, on record, with evidence that can't be dismissed or destroyed. If we don't stop them tomorrow, they'll disappear and start over somewhere else. How many more families will they destroy while we're building another case? Cordelia was typing furiously on her laptop. I'm calling Agent Morrison. We need more security. No, Caspian said sharply. Too many federal agents will spook them. They'll abort everything and run. Then what do you suggest? Serafina demanded. Let them kill you for the sake of a confession. Caspian smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it was genuinely warm. I suggest we give them exactly what they're expecting, just not the way they're expecting it. He spread out architectural drawings of the country club, pointing to various entrances and exits. They'll try to isolate me during the reception, probably lure me somewhere private with an excuse about photography equipment or a special shot they want. But what if I'm not alone when they make their move? What do you mean? I mean, what if the groom happens to overhear his father ordering a murder? What if Sterling realizes that Daddy's plans put him at risk too? Caspian traced a route through the building's service corridors. Men like Sterling are ultimately cowards. When faced with real consequences, they turn on each other to save themselves. Serafina studied the plans, beginning to understand his strategy. You want to play them against each other. I want to create a situation where Sterling has to choose between protecting his father and protecting himself. Based on everything I know about his character, he'll choose himself every time. It's risky, Cordelia said. If something goes wrong. Something's already gone wrong, Serafina interrupted. They murdered my grandfather. They were planning to drug me and steal everything I own. They've destroyed dozens of families over 3 generations. She looked directly at Caspian, seeing her own determination reflected in his golden eyes. I'm not backing down now. Caspian nodded slowly. Then we do this right. Full confession, multiple witnesses, recorded evidence that will hold up in court. He turned to Cordelia. Can you get the media there without tipping them off? Channel 8's investigative team is already sniffing around. I can make sure they're in position to broadcast live when things get interesting. Perfect. By tomorrow evening, the Ravencrest name will be front-page news for all the wrong reasons. They spent the next 4 hours going over every detail of the plan, from the timing of Serafina's entrance to the positioning of hidden cameras throughout the venue. As the evening wore on, Cordelia finally excused herself to make calls to her contacts in law enforcement, leaving Serafina and Caspian alone in the basement war room. "Are you scared?" Caspian asked quietly. "Terrified," Serafina admitted. "But not of Sterling anymore. I'm scared of what happens after. When all this is over, and I have to figure out who I am without this mission defining me. You'll still be you, just stronger. Will you still be you? Or will you disappear once the Ravencrest family is destroyed?" Caspian was quiet for a long moment, studying the photographs of his parents that he'd pinned to the timeline. "I've spent so many years focused on revenge that I'm not sure who I am without it. But these last few days, working with you, seeing your courage." He turned to face her. "I remember what it felt like to want something other than justice. What do you want? A life. A real one, with someone who understands that the past shapes you but doesn't have to define you." His voice was soft, uncertain in a way that made her heart ache. "Someone like you." Serafina stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his expression. "Caspian, I know the timing is terrible. I know you're about to face the worst day of your life, and I have no right to complicate things further." He reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "But I need you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, these feelings are real. You're not a means to an end anymore. You haven't been for days." She leaned into his touch, letting herself feel something other than anger and betrayal for the first time since discovering Sterling's deception. When this is over, we'll have time to figure out what we mean to each other. If you want to." "I want to," she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle toward a man who'd planned to destroy her. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged. The Moonrise Bay Country Club had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, with white roses cascading from every surface and crystal chandeliers casting prismatic rainbows across the marble floors. 300 guests filled the ballroom, representing the cream of Maine society, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a sea of understated wealth and power. Serafina stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror. The dress was perfect, a vintage-inspired creation of silk and lace that had cost more than most people's cars. Her hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her makeup was flawless. She looked like every bride's dream of herself on her wedding day. The irony wasn't lost on her. "The transmitter is working perfectly," Cordelia whispered, adjusting Serafina's veil one final time. FBI agents are positioned throughout the crowd, and the media crew is set up in the back as official wedding videographers. "Any sign of trouble?" "Sterling's father arrived 20 minutes ago with 2 men I don't recognize. They're staying close to the exits." Cordelia's voice was tight with concern. "Caspian's already in position near the altar, but I don't like how exposed he is." Serafina nodded, her stomach churning with a mixture of nerves and anticipation. In 15 minutes, she would walk down that aisle and destroy the man who had planned to destroy her. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but all she felt was a cold determination that surprised her with its intensity. "Time to go," Cordelia said softly. The walk to the ballroom felt like moving through a dream. Guests lined the hallway, offering congratulations and admiring glances that made her skin crawl. How many of them knew what Sterling really was? How many were complicit in the Ravencrest family's crimes? At the ballroom entrance, she caught sight of Caspian adjusting his camera near the altar. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he gave her the smallest nod. Everything was ready. The wedding march began, and Serafina started her walk down the aisle alone, having chosen to honor her late grandfather by walking without an escort. The guests rose as one, their faces turned toward her with expressions of genuine happiness that made her feel sick. These people thought they were witnessing a love story. Instead, they were about to see the final act of a decades-long criminal conspiracy. Sterling waited at the altar in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his blue eyes bright with what anyone else would have interpreted as love and anticipation. But Serafina could see the calculation behind his smile, the way his gaze flickered to her hands as if already imagining the moment she would sign away her inheritance. "You look beautiful," he murmured as she reached the altar, taking her hands in his. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady despite the wildness of her heartbeat. Judge Harrison, bought and paid for by the Ravencrest family, began the ceremony with practiced solemnity. Serafina barely heard the opening words, focused instead on the weight of the transmitter against her collarbone and the knowledge that everything said here would be recorded for posterity. "Sterling," Judge Harrison said, "please share your vows." Sterling smiled that charming smile that had once made her heart race, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Serafina, from the moment I saw you at the charity gala, I knew you were different from anyone I'd ever met. You have something that can't be bought or sold, something precious that I want to protect and cherish for the rest of our lives." The guests sighed collectively at the romantic words, but Serafina heard the hidden meaning. He was talking about her inheritance, her properties, her wealth. Even now, at the altar, he couldn't resist gloating about his victory. "I promise to take care of everything you've inherited from your family," Sterling continued, his eyes glittering with avarice disguised as devotion. "I promise to make sure your grandfather's legacy is preserved and protected under my guidance. I promise to love, honor, and possess you completely, until death do us part." The word possess hung in the air like a thread, and Serafina saw several guests exchange glances. Even they seemed to sense something wrong with the phrasing. "Serafina," Judge Harrison said, "your vows." This was the moment. Serafina looked out at the assembled crowd, at the faces of people who had known her family for generations, at the cameras that would broadcast this moment to the world. Then she looked directly at Sterling, letting him see the cold fury in her green eyes. "Sterling," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics, "I also have something to say about what you want to possess." Sterling's smile faltered slightly, but he maintained his composure. The guests leaned forward, expecting romantic declarations. "3 days ago, I discovered that everything about our relationship has been a lie," Serafina said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I learned that you researched me for months before we met, that you hired a private investigator to analyze my inheritance, and that you've been planning to steal my family's properties from the moment you introduced yourself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sterling's face had gone white, but he forced a laugh. "Sarah, what are you talking about? Wedding nerves are making you." "I'm talking about murder, Sterling." Serafina's voice cut through his attempt at deflection like a blade. "I'm talking about the systematic destruction of Maine families over 3 generations. I'm talking about your family's business model of romance, marriage, and murder." Judge Harrison started to intervene, but Serafina gestured to Caspian, who had moved to the projection equipment they'd hidden among the wedding decorations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Serafina announced, "I'd like to share some evidence with you." The ballroom screens, intended to display romantic wedding photos, instead lit up with documents, bank records, and recorded conversations. Sterling's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "Once the properties are transferred, we can decide whether she's more useful alive or dead." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps echoed through the ballroom, followed by shocked exclamations and the scraping of chairs as guests rose to their feet. Sterling lunged toward the projection equipment, but FBI agents materialized from the crowd, surrounding him before he could reach it. "This is insane," Sterling shouted, his composure finally cracking. "She's having some kind of breakdown." "Actually," Caspian said, stepping forward with his camera still recording, "she's having a moment of perfect clarity." Sterling's eyes widened as he recognized the man he'd planned to have killed. "You're supposed to be dead?" Caspian's smile was sharp. "Sorry to disappoint you, but I have been looking forward to this conversation for 15 years. The screens now showed photographs of the Ravencrest family's victims, including Caspian's parents and Serafina's grandfather. A timeline of suspicious deaths, forged documents, and stolen properties stretched across multiple displays. "My name is Caspian Silverstone," he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying over the chaos. "My family owned 7 historic properties in Maine until the Ravencrest family murdered my parents and stole everything we had. Tonight, justice finally comes home." Sterling's father had been trying to slip toward an exit, but FBI agents blocked his path. When he saw the evidence displayed on the screens, his face contorted with rage. "You stupid boy," he snarled at Sterling. You were supposed to handle the photographer. You were supposed to keep her under control. I tried. Sterling shot back, panic replacing his usual smooth confidence. She started asking questions about the trust documents. I told you we should have just taken the traditional approach. The traditional approach? Agent Morrison stepped forward, badge visible. You mean murder? I never said murder. Sterling backpedaled frantically. I never agreed to hurt anyone. This was all his idea. He pointed at his father with desperate accusation. I just wanted to marry her and take the properties legally. I never signed up for killing anyone. The recorded conversations suggest otherwise. Agent Morrison replied dryly as handcuffs clicked around Sterling's wrists. Serafina watched the man she'd thought she loved being arrested for conspiracy to commit murder and felt nothing but a vast sense of relief. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her 3 days ago seemed like a lifetime ago. She was free, her grandfather's killer would face justice, and the Ravencrest family's reign of terror was finally over. As Sterling was led away, he looked back at her one final time. You have no idea what you've done, he said, his voice filled with venom. You think you've won, but you've just made yourself a target for people far worse than my family. Maybe, Serafina replied calmly, but I'm not the naive girl you thought you were marrying. I'm someone who fights back. The ballroom erupted in applause, and Serafina realized that her wedding day had become something even better than she'd originally planned. It had become her liberation day. 6 months after what the main media had dubbed the wedding scandal of the century, Serafina stood on the wraparound porch of the restored Willowbrook estate, watching Caspian photograph the sunset through the ancient oak trees. The property looked nothing like it had during her grandfather's time, but somehow it felt more like home than ever before. The legal aftermath had been swift and decisive. Sterling received 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and racketeering. His father got life without parole after DNA evidence linked him to 4 unsolved homicides spanning 2 decades. Judge Harrison and a dozen other officials were facing their own charges, and the FBI had seized over $40 million in stolen assets. Most importantly, the properties that had been stolen from families like the Silverstones were being returned to their rightful heirs. The light's perfect, Caspian called from the garden, his camera clicking steadily. You should see yourself right now. Serafina smiled, remembering how suspicious she'd been of his photography that first day. Now she understood that he saw beauty everywhere, especially in moments of genuine happiness. The coffee table book he'd originally claimed to be working on had become real, a stunning documentation of Maine's historic properties and the families who preserved them. Are you documenting me for posterity? She asked, walking down to join him among the rose bushes they'd planted together. Always. Caspian lowered his camera and pulled her into his arms. Though I have to admit, I'm more interested in living these moments than just capturing them. The difference between Caspian and Sterling was like comparing sunlight to artificial illumination. Everything with Sterling had been calculated, performed, designed to manipulate her emotions. With Caspian, every touch, every glance, every quiet conversation felt completely authentic. Cordelia called this morning, Serafina said, leaning against his chest. The Ashworth Silverstone Foundation received another grant application. A family in Bar Harbor whose grandmother's cottage is being threatened by developers with suspicious connections to former Ravencrest associates. We'll look into it tomorrow. Caspian's arms tightened around her. Tonight is for us. The foundation had been Caspian's idea, a way to use their combined resources and expertise to protect other families from the kind of predators they'd defeated. Serafina provided the funding and architectural knowledge, while Caspian handled investigations and security. In 6 months, they'd helped 12 families protect their properties and exposed 3 separate inheritance fraud schemes. I have something for you, Caspian said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Serafina's breath caught as he pulled out a small velvet box. Not the ostentatious Ravencrest family heirloom Sterling had given her, but a simple platinum band set with her grandmother's emerald, which Caspian had somehow retrieved from the evidence locker. I know we agreed to take things slowly, he said, dropping to one knee in the garden where they'd first admitted their feelings for each other. But I'm tired of waiting for the perfect moment. Every moment with you is perfect. Caspian, I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I'm asking you to build a life with me, whatever that looks like. Marry me next year, or in 5 years, or whenever you're ready. I just want to know that we're in this together." Serafina looked down at the man who had risked everything to save her, who had spent 15 years seeking justice for his family and somehow found love in the process. The answer was easy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. When he stood to kiss her, Serafina felt the last piece of her old life fall away, replaced by something infinitely better. 3 months later, they were married in the same garden, with 30 guests instead of 300. Cordelia served as maid of honor, wiping away tears as she pronounced them the most stubborn couple in Maine, who somehow managed to find each other despite their best efforts to complicate everything. Sterling's final threat about making enemies had proven empty. The network of corruption he'd represented was too busy scrambling to avoid prosecution to worry about revenge against the woman who'd exposed them. As Serafina and Caspian danced to soft jazz music under string lights hung between the oak trees, she thought about the naive woman who had walked down a different aisle 6 months ago. That woman had been searching for love in all the wrong places, mistaking manipulation for romance and possession for devotion. This woman knew the difference between fool's gold and the real thing. "Any regrets?" Caspian murmured against her ear. Serafina looked around at their small gathering of friends, at the home they'd restored together, at the foundation they'd built to protect others from the predators who had once threatened them both. "Only that we didn't find each other sooner," she said, and meant it completely. The past had shaped them both, but it no longer defined them. They were writing their own story now, and it was going to be extraordinary.